Here we go. Okay, welcome everyone to a roundtable discussion on transnational intelligence oversight, perspectives, challenges, and the road ahead. We are delighted and honored today to host an esteemed panel of participants, not only from across the United States, but also from across the globe. My name is Alfredo Toro Carnevali. I am a full-time faculty in the Department of Political Science and Law here at Montclair State University. I am also a member of the Research on Interdisciplinary Global Studies, or RIGS in short, which is a faculty-led network that fuels research collaborations across our campus and beyond. So also as a member of RIGS, it is my pleasure to announce that RIGS, in collaboration with the Polish Speaker Series on International Security and Diplomacy, is sponsoring this event. Without further ado, I now like to pass on the baton to my esteemed colleague, Professor Arnaud Kurs, who will moderate today's session. I wish you all an enriching and lively discussion.
Thank you so much, Alfredo, for the kind introductions. Welcome everybody today. And I think we couldn't be in a livelier or timelier spot in terms of discussing intelligence in light of the most recent events where we started shooting at balloons similar to what Nina, the 1980s pop star, has so much acclaimed or dreadfully sang about with the 99 Luftballons, right? And so, or balloons. And so let me really briefly introduce our really esteemed panelists that really brought us here on campus, but also remotely and virtually to get together to discuss a research report that we'll learn more about on transnational intelligence overview. To my left here, probably on the screen to my right, is Professor Didier Vigot, who is a professor of international political sociology at Sciences Po Paris, but he also has a dual appointment at King's College. He has spent the better part of his scholarly career sort of addressing questions of security, human rights, and of course in relation to intelligence and terrorism, among others. He's certainly also the lead principal investigator in a multi-year international research project called GUARDINT, which sort of closed at the end of last year, and which accumulated in this research report that was written by multiple authors, the panelists here, Didier, myself, and Elspeth Gill to my right included. And so that brings us to the second guest here in the room. Professor Elspeth Gill is a professor of law, more specifically the Jean Monnet professor ad personam at Queen Mary University in London, and is also at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. I hope I wasn't butchering these names too much. I'm German, unfortunately not Dutch, but her list of accomplishments would fill volumes and tons. And so I really, in this brief introduction, wouldn't do any justice to this. And her expertise is certainly on focuses on EU law, and particularly EU justice and home affairs, for instance, immigration, asylum, border controls, criminal law, police, and judicial cooperation in criminal matters. But she also researches EU privacy and data protection law in connection with human rights. And so as part of the co-author of the report, we'll also learn more about some of these fields and how they sort of our research is being reflected here. And then in addition, from the panelists that are here on campus today with us, we have from the Greater Washington DC area, more specifically from Virginia, Cynthia Nolan, who is associate professor at American Military University, and she has examined questions of intelligence and democratic values in or with regards to respective human rights values. And so her insights on her research will certainly draw from her research and help us also better understand these tensions in terms of intelligence and democracy, which are also at the core of the report. And last, we have from the West Coast in LA joining us, Michael German. He's currently a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and Liberty and National Security Program, which seeks to ensure that the US respects, especially the US government, human rights and fundamental freedoms when conducting the fight against terrorism. As a former special agent with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. Before he joined the Brennan Center, Mike also served as the Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy for the American Civil Liberties Union, or short ACLU, in Washington's legislative office. And so today's conversation, roundtable discussion, will be divided into several parts. We'll start with sort of an overview of the content of the report, which was the original impetus for today's roundtable. And this will sort of be followed by some comments and a discussion by Cindy and Mike. And so we have then basically Mike and Cindy sort of given their thoughts and comments with regards to the executive summary of the report. And then we'll sort of shift the focus onto the road ahead of our report, where Elspeth was able to, or will guide us through sort of a legal landscape of perspective on how to tackle some of these transnational oversight issues. And then we'll have sort of an open forum of questions where I might draw on certain aspects from my part of the report before we then the general Q&A session. So without further ado here, let's get this started with Didier, who will kick us off in terms of the big picture items, the 35,000 foot overview with regards to the content. And we'll make sure that everyone has about 5-7 minutes to express themselves freely. If I see you go over time, I try to be the arbiter, but I want you to have enough time to express your thoughts. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Arno. It's a pleasure to be with you here at Montreal University and on this Zoom. What is the purpose of this? The purpose of this report is to look at the imbalance between the facts that you have, not only intelligence services or secret services, they are in coalition. They are in coalition, so they act internationally. On the other hand, you have oversight in different democracies about their role, but they are not internationally connected. This oversight are national oversight. They work or they don't work very well, but in any case, they don't have really the overview because they are blocked by the fact that when you have co-production of data, which happens a lot, between the intelligence services, what happens? Anytime they will say, you can look at my own data, but not on the data that the other have given to us. Fine, when it was about spying, counter-spying, but with counterterrorism, with the production of large amount of data, with the extension of the virtual target and the number of people affected, then it changed radically. And that's what this report is about. How is it possible that you have so much large-scale surveillance but also secret actions, which are really important. We know about them. We had, of course, it began in the possibility to have the coalition in the war on terror and the CIA network, with what happens about the impunity to do so. And we can go back to that. How can we fight against this impunity of the coalition and the complicity between these services? We have also the large-scale surveillance revealed by Edward Snowden, but also by many others. And Edward Snowden is a peak of an iceberg. And more recently, we had also another element, which is how many companies who are from democratic countries have sold easy technology of spying, which have been used all over the world. In Latin America, a lot of people have been spied through Pegasus technology. We can come back to that, which are the kind of software that some company, Israeli company, in that case, NSO, put in the iPhone or in other computers that have attacked directly civil liberties of opponents over the world. So we have a lot of elements which were wrong in this coalition of secret services. So the argument would be, we know about that. Why don't we have an equivalent in terms of oversight? And one of the elements of the answer is yes, you have now a move to go towards some oversight in terms of legitimacy that the intelligence services needs to have in democratic countries if they don't want to look exactly the same than the authority. So you have always this idea that you cannot have everything that the technology gives you the right to do. You always have to set up limits. Democracy is about this capacity to create some limits that you cannot go beyond that. That's banal. Many people say yes, and many governments say yes. Inside the intelligence services, from the interview, many people who are not at the top, but who are at the bottom and who want to be protected, say yes. But nevertheless, you have an official discourse of the secret services. And come back to how you have an official discourse, secret organization. It's called now not the nicer comment of the eye. It's about strategic communication. We need to justify what we are doing. But here, what is really important is that most of the most important secret services from US, from UK, and France are not in favor at all about this kind of policy. Why? They want to continue with the idea that if you protect democracy, if you protect the people, then you don't have to have limits, because if you have limits, you will lose against others. And that's the core of the justification. And we need to go beyond that and to analyze what are the relations which have been done between these different elements. So we need to settle, and that's a little bit the purpose of this report, to have contact at multinational level with different kind of form of oversight or monitoring or official or coming from civil society that can work together. And working together, they will give the possibility to overcome what has been called the third-party rule. What is this third-party rule? It's the fact that, as I said, if you have given some data, the other party cannot give to a third party this element without your authorization. And they will not give the authorization, which is a very strict interpretation of the rule because it's nowhere. And this rule are agreements between people in a term which are secret, not public. So we will have to discuss that because you have really an important element where if we want to change the relation between this capacity of this coalition of secret services to put in danger the relation they have with the other politicians, their own politicians, but the politicians cover, and with also the civil society by using a lot of technology through transnational. And this is really, I think, what is at the core of the discussion. I will not develop more. We can go back to some of these elements in a minute.
Great, thank you so much, Didier, and I'll turn it over to for instance, Cindy, will maybe from the 35,000 foot view to sort of a more compact, right? Didier mentioned some of the European nations, whether that's France or Germany, etc. You worked on the US, and maybe based on your own experience and research, as I said earlier, that tension between what is democratic, what are sort of democratic values, and the protection of fundamental rights and human rights, and to what extent is this this legitimacy of intelligence, that cloak of secrecy, a hindrance, and you mentioned in your research sort of there is this important pillar, and so I'll turn it over to you. And you've also read hopefully the entire report or parts of the report. So what are some of your reflections, and then
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much, Arnaud, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. Arnaud asked me to comment on the report, and I'm really happy to do that. I thought I would comment a little bit about the goals and reasons, and then tell you a little bit about what I thought, obviously. Just building a little bit on what Didier said, though, I do think what strikes me as really interesting is that 20 years ago, we wouldn't have had this report. Like you wouldn't have been writing this report, because I don't think the problems that you're talking about now would have been here, right? And I'm an old school intelligence collector from many years ago, and so I admit I'm somewhat sympathetic to that third party rule. You know, protecting sources and methods and all that. So maybe we could talk about that later. But so that's my background as the old time collector. It seems to me that your starting point for the project is that the technological capabilities of intelligence agencies to collect information has improved so dramatically, and resulted in such a large scale collection of data that we all know, we all talk about, that the oversight has to change accordingly. So like if the collection is changing, and what's happening has to change, then the oversight has to change too. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And we've also witnessed it, as Didier said, cooperation between intelligence agencies, specifically an extraordinary rendition. And in that covert action, that happens to such a degree that oversight has to be cooperative as well. So when we see changes in what's happening in terms of collection or in terms of covert action, then the oversight should really change accordingly. And I think that's your starting point. And as I said, I don't think that would have happened 20 years ago, which makes this paper what's so interesting, and such a good starting point. And so given those two really big changes over the last 20 years, your project, is about similar changes. Now, typically oversight, in my experience, in my research, is an afterward event, right? It's something that happens after some big wrongdoing that gets out in public, and then we see big hearings or changes in the law, or we get this big media attention, and then intelligence agencies have to sort of admit some kind of wrongdoing or go on trial almost in the public, in the public sphere, and then someone gets in trouble, and then we make some kind of changes. And so that's like the typical idea of oversight. But I think your project, I'm super sympathetic to this idea that you kind of want to attack those instances of wrongdoing before they happen, right? So that we can try to have some kind of benefit for the intelligence communities, but more specifically for democracy, before these kinds of wrongdoings happen, right? So we can do something a priori rather than ex post facto. And so that I'm really sympathetic to that. I think it's a really great goal, because that heading off that wrongdoing ahead of time is definitely worthwhile, right? You list in the paper some of the best practices for intelligence agencies, specifically in democratic countries within the Five Eyes agreement and beyond. And so those are really helpful, the things that you put in the paper. You also highlight the comparative aspect of the project, and you talk about how oversight needs to be in all aspects, no matter what it kind of looks like. It needs to be independent, investigative, have to have full access to the intelligence, has to stay secret, and it has to have those resources. And I think those are all great, really great points. So I would like to add a little bit to the research stage of this project. And I wanted to point out that in my own research, in my own experience, I would say that when intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and covert action are all situated in the same location, that's when the trouble happens. That's when trouble is more likely. That's when we get these big cases of wrongdoing and public media attention, because you have when you have the same person or the same people doing all those things, collecting the intelligence, deciding what it means, analyzing it, and then also deciding what to do about it and do some kind of covert action, that's when boundaries are pushed, right? And that's what Didier is talking about, and how democracy needs those boundaries. Like without those boundaries, we're not really protecting human rights. We're not really protecting the privacy of our citizens. We're not really protecting the citizens of our countries. And so those boundaries are really important. But when we combine those three aspects, the person making the decision about what to do, the person who's collecting, and the person who's analyzing, we put them all in the same person, and that's when we have trouble. So we need oversight at all three of those stages. And I think that's something that sort of is maybe reading between the lines of some of your project in the paper that I read. So, and as you rightly point out, the boundaries for intelligence are there to protect democracies and the citizens in democracies. And so when those boundaries are overstepped, that's when we get scandals and wrongdoing and all these things that you talk about in the paper, and the extraordinary rendition, and the things that maybe we wouldn't want democracies to do. And that's what I think you're arguing has happened over the last 20 years. And so, if I've read the report correctly. Anyway, overall, I think that was, an awesome start. And I also suspect it's not the end, right? You guys have been working at this for a long time, but I also think you're not done, right? I suspect you're still working, yeah? And so I think in particular, Elspeth will tell us a little bit about the legal answers. And so I think that would be interesting to compare across the countries that you've looked at to see as well. So those are a few of my initial reactions to the report. So thank you for letting me jump in there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cindy. And I want to give Mike also a chance, given also your semi sort of legal and policy background, to also comment on some of the either report facts or to what extent your personal professional also experience has sort of shaped also your reform efforts that you're trying to push, and whether you sort of also agree with Cindy on these different steps. Right, I've done some research on more recent developments that will be also part of a publication on the U.S. level, and here we really see the problem of if it's within the service, right? Can it be taken seriously? And so maybe, given that you worked in the services yourself, what's your stance on these issues?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate it, and I feel somewhat unarmed because most of my work is looking at domestic policy and domestic issues, and I find that extremely difficult. The legal framework that we've set up to protect the American people from our own government's surveillance capabilities, law enforcement, and intelligence services have proven so weak and easily circumvented that I think I'll start by commending you for this effort to build something much broader in an area that doesn't get enough attention, because of course the way the United States national security establishment looks at limits on intelligence activities, they have limits on what they can do to US persons, but far less limits on what they can do to anybody who's not a US person. And I think the structure of the report I really appreciate, because I think it's very important to highlight in the beginning the harms, because one of the frustrating parts about having been behind the curtain and seen how things work, my position has always been the lack of effective restraints and the lack of effective legal restraints and the lack of effective oversight to ensure those restraints followed don't just do damage to the general public and damage to the image of our democracy, but damage to the organization. And you include that here, that the loss of public confidence or even the animosity that's built against these agencies, it is a significant harm, not just a harm in the way that organization can operate, but a harm to our democracy. And it's fascinating to me to see how our technology has transformed the capabilities of the intelligence agencies. And you would think, therefore, we would be a much more peaceful world because we can identify problems quickly, but actually the opposite is true. And I think it's because we lack these accountability mechanisms, and particularly accountability mechanisms that bring abuses to public light, right? They're in the domestic foreign intelligence area, there was a President's Intelligence Oversight Board that we used to refer in the FBI as the secret spanking. If you were reported for some kind of violation, you might get a finger wag and a letter in your file, but it isn't anything that's going to do anything to harm your career or your reputation in the public. So I think that public accountability is really much more important. And unfortunately, in the way that, for example, the FBI, where I work, looks at a lot of the abuses, is they consider that a positive outcome, right? That, okay, well, now at least bad people will know that we are out there. And, there's the old COINTELPRO era J. Edgar Hoover memo that he says he wants these protesters to think there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox, as if that will somehow curb their behavior in some way. I think that you approached it well in setting up that harm. But I think what I'd like to see more discussion of is how ineffective these measures have been, right? That the Pentagon after 9/11 started this concept of total information awareness. And the idea was that if we had all the data, we would know everything. And that unfortunately wasn't a very good idea from the beginning. And it drove a lot of the mass surveillance programs that are out there and continue to drive them, where the failure of these processes to identify threats before they materialize and assist in the intervention to prevent those threats is seen as, well, we haven't accomplished enough total awareness. We need more data, or we have to work on the mathematical algorithm that's going to help us separate the wheat from the chaff, rather than recognizing this is an improper method that does the privacy and civil liberties harms and undermines confidence in our institution and isn't an effective methodology to identify threats. And we certainly have seen that not just in the United States, but worldwide, where these highly touted, very expensive, very intrusive programs turn out not to have produced the results that were claimed through the life of these programs until they reached some point of public accountability. And then once they had to put up the evidence that this was effective, they fall apart. And certainly the Edward Snowden leaks are a part of that. And then I'll move on to the next parts of the report. I think it's really interesting the way it's looked at as kind of what the intelligence agencies will do, what the community can do working from the systems that they have, and the other hand, how we can build privacy laws to protect the public. And I think that's both are necessary. My concern with using privacy as a mechanism is that this concept of balancing security and intelligence against privacy is always a losing gamble for us privacy advocates, right? If they can present, if the intelligence agencies, national security agencies present the threat as existential, of course, nobody's privacy is worth an existential threat to a nation or to a group of nations. So we have to bulwark privacy with other safeguards to make sure that this balance isn't so easily tipped towards letting them do what they want. And in the safeguards built within the community or by the community, I think what Professor Bigo just said, one of the things, and sort of gets to what Professor Nolan just said, where there's this option of before or after, and I think after has proven not just terribly ineffective, but tragic, right? I mean, in the United States, the most, or what's often pointed at as the most effective congressional oversight of the intelligence community is an executive summary of a torture report that was released some 9 years after these abuses took place. And of course, the people being tortured knew about it as it was happening, right? They didn't need the Senate to tell them what was happening. There were leaks all along the way. So this type of post hoc accountability is, I think, even more damaging, because what you had in that time is the agencies building a false construction of justification for what they did that, as the report indicates, conflicted with their internal records. In other words, they built a wall of lies to defend a program that had a disastrous effect, not just for the law and the people tortured, but for the institution itself. So it was trying to protect itself, even though its own records revealed the truth, but also that we still haven't seen the whole report. It's astonishing where I think what we need to have is a system where we don't just take the agency's word for it that these methods are effective, it can be effective, will address the problem that's identified, that they have to show that on the front end, and that there's analysis of these as they go in order to justify using them, particularly when it's obvious they'll have a negative impact on individual privacy and democracy writ large. So I'll keep that shorter. I'm sorry for going on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. And I certainly echo some of the challenges that you've expressed here. certainly that when we get to these privacy laws, and as you said, having worked at ACLU, right, trying to almost have that Don Quixote windmill fight, right? It's quite a continuous struggle, and I think this is a perfect moment to bring out or bring in our legal expert here, and give us some hope, but also, of course, there might be some challenges that we'll tackle, and we'll sort of loop back to some of these at the end, where then all of us can sort of say a few more words. But without further ado, maybe Elspeth, you want to share some of your thoughts in terms of how from a legal perspective we can sort of tackle or think about these things, because a lot of times it's sort of changing the culture and the way we look at things, and that was one of the anchors also of the report, right? How to map it on the community.
Thank you so much, Arno, and thank you so much for organizing this meeting. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's fascinating to have some feedback and some comments. I'm going to do a bit of, the glass is half full rather than glass is half empty number. So bear with me. And I think I have to come back first to Mike's very cogent comments about, is privacy a strong enough right on which to build a system of oversight? And I'll come back to that in a minute, because it is indeed a qualified right. And I would only use the example of the European Data Protection Supervisor. We have a data protection system in the European Union, which is designed to protect privacy. And in the legislation, the supervisor has been given the entitlement to go into any premises and to examine what data had been collected, whether lawfully collected, etc. So about 6 months ago, the supervisor went into the offices of the European Policing Agency, which is called Europol, and they demanded to see access to data they'd been collecting. And they promptly said to Europol, 90% of the data you have collected illegally. It is being stored unlawfully. You are using it unlawfully, and it must be deleted within 24 hours. And Europol had to comply. So I don't think we should despair about the possibility of using a building on privacy if we provide a supervision mechanism which is strong enough to actually carry out the requirement. Of course, Europol doesn't have the same national security kind of role that the intelligence services do. So I want to come back a moment to the question of the transnational problem. So if, as seems to be the case from the empirical research which has been done in this project, an enormous amount of the person being used by interconnected global north intelligence services, in particular the Five Eyes, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but with the colleagues around, if an enormous amount of that is actually shared data, and I think in the case of Belgium, the idea was about 80% of the data that they're working with in their intelligence services is shared from other partners. Then how do we protect that data in light of the third party rule? And I think the first thing that I would say is, if we want a kind of supervision system, which, like the European Data Protection Supervisor, can walk into the intelligence agency of any of these countries and say, this data has been unlawfully transferred, it has been unlawfully collected, it has been unlawfully used, it is passed to cell data, etc. This kind of sort of superpower. We need to start off with some kind of common position. And if you're going to have a supervisor needs a mandate. If you're going to talk about a transnational supervisor, the supervisor is going to need a transnational mandate, not a national mandate. So we're, instead of, I think that instead of trying to knit together, what would the national mandates be if they were knitted together? So taking this mandate and trying to knit it together with the mandate of the IPT in the UK and the mandate of whoever they are, etc. Should we not look at this from the perspective of the protection of those who are at risk of harm and place it in a human rights framework? So say Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which protects privacy. Why should we not use this, even though it's a qualified right, as a common one to which all of these countries have voluntarily committed themselves? Nobody forces countries to sign conventions. And once they've ratified them, if they really don't like them, they can always denounce them and no longer be bound by them. But as long as they remain parties to conventions, shouldn't they apply them? And using that logic, can we not say then, well, we've developed a whole series of rules around Article 17, the right to privacy and data protection at the international level in the UN. Is this not the foundation for a supranational supervision mechanism? Because if we don't have a common starting place, what is the right we're protecting? How are we ever going to determine complex ideas like necessity and proportionality? Is it necessary to collect and use this information? Is it proportionate? Because as Mike says, as soon as we have those concepts, what is the necessity and proportionality of privacy over national security? Unless we have a right for protecting, a common agreement, it's a scale. It's not an absolute, and it can go in any direction, so you can never win unless you have your primary right. And you say, well, any interference is an interference with that right. We've all agreed it internationally, and we can then look at proportionality and necessity against the right and the harm to the individual. And I think this is perhaps where we were trying, Sophia and myself were trying to take, we said, well, what might that look like? Do we have any examples? And then we look at the additional protocols to the Convention Against Torture. And we say, actually, yes, there are some really good mechanisms and possibilities out there where we could set up institutions which will have a transnational reach. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you so much, Alfred. And I think, so we sort of the overview to some of the trenches, back to sort of the legal broad overview and the hope, right? The silver lining. And I'll bring us back to reality in terms of how does that look in some cases. And so when I was asked to join the research team, and which I'm very grateful, because it was really a team that worked out of the UK, in Germany and France. So I was sort of charged responsible in terms of sort of mapping some of these challenges, and I want to use Elspeth as sort of her transnational idea and bring it back to sort of the US case. You mentioned the Foreign Intelligence Security Act from after Watergate in the late 70s, where sort of the idea is certainly to provide a protection in terms of surveillance. And so what I wanted to bring in is who does the law, right? Or who does then actually sentence or give its opinion? It's the judges, right? And so I think when we think in terms of legal framework, how we create it internationally or transnationally, that is one thing. You have all these different stakeholders, and they're worthwhile a discussion, right? Because what earlier in momentum building, it is civil society, it is policymakers. But when we pause or hover briefly in terms of the US and the reputation of the FISC court, sort of this federal system where federal justices or judges are part of the gamble or of that structure, we have to remember that federal judges are appointed by the president. And we know that under the last presidency, we had quite a push by the president to nominate a lot of conservative judges because of the Federalist Society's push in terms of lobbying the White House. So there was a push and pull here. And so that certainly puts a big question mark in terms of on which side do these judges usually sentence? Is it in terms of this national security doctrine, or is it in terms of human rights, fundamental rights, and privacy, right? And so the next layer is how our system here in the US is built upon, right? When you think about our Supreme Court, having these debates and discussions today, the 6 versus 3 divide, conservative, very politicized institution now. Well, I mean, it's always been politicized. Think of 1803, Madison versus Marbury. I mean, here they clearly had to say, we're staying out of government business. And not because they just said like, oh, you do you and we do ourselves. It was to legitimize their own existence. And so from the very get-go, they decided what the government does is government affairs, and we are one pillar, and there's separation of powers, right? And so that is one of the ground problems today, what we see in terms of how far can a judge go, but luckily, and Elspeth has a lot more examples given her expertise in the field, there are ample cases where judges are courageous enough to sort of embrace not the national security doctrine, but that doctrine where we have fundamental rights and the government can't cover everything up. And so I think this really leaves us with the big question of how far can judges go in the future. Cindy mentioned sort of like you were not able or could have been able to do this report 20 years ago. I completely agree, and it's only the building stone. As you know, those who have read the report, we have not come up with recommendations. We really did a clear mapping. What are the issues? And trying to figure out that we need sort of a transversal approach by looking at the different actors, looking at the power structures, looking to what extent these different pieces fit within the puzzle. And so what I want to do maybe in the remaining minutes here, touch upon some of the key points that you guys made by giving you an opportunity to reflect on each other's comments, right? And also have, for instance, did we say a few words where you see this this project going, and then Elspeth, what you see, for instance, in terms of the role of judges that could have broader normative framework, legal and normative framework, despite challenges that they're facing, not only in the US, also in the EU, although the sentencing on the EU level were a lot more favorable than in the US at times. And then for you, Cindy and Mike, it'll be certainly great also to reflect on, I mean, Mike, with regards to domestic issues where you see the greatest potential for reform. And Cindy, you certainly talked about the a posteriori and sort of the timeless or temporal aspect of where oversight should fit in, and maybe you could also expand a bit on that, where you could see the greatest potential here, given the caveat that we said there was certainly within the institution sort of either walls or sort of a repetition of these old sort of doctrines that really hamper any move forward. And then I don't know to what extent you might have worked on also the 5i and the oversight council, the review council of York, right, or IOR, and to what extent you see the limitations of a mechanism there because it's so internal and there's very limited input from the outside world here. So that's on my end. I think maybe in order of fairness, we'll have Didier say a few words, and then we'll go around the table and then close it.
Yeah. Wow, it's so interesting. I would like to highlight maybe some elements in the debate that we have worked a little bit. I think that that the interest of the intelligence services is really in terms of surveillance to say the new technology here. Private company use it, why not us? And so the control of the internet, global surveillance is what it is. You cannot come back to anything and to impose limits. Remember when automobile arrived, the cars arrived, the idea to have a code about driving was considered as completely illegitimate until you had so many car accidents that they say, oh, maybe it's a good idea. We need to say, you have now the idea that technology always go beyond law and quicker than law, and that law cannot do anything, that they are always late. That's a discourse which is the discourse of most intelligence services. But it's only one component, because they don't want to come back to what was the other component, which was the legitimation of the survey. It's to transform the idea of security from security after the fact, which was called criminal justice. Remember, justice was there, which has disappeared from the discourse to preventive security. But preventive, of course, what does that mean? That means to act before the other. So what is the key word? The word suspicion. Because you don't act after, you anticipate. So you are suspecting something. And data suspicion is a core element, because you gather data not about what the world has been, but what about the worst case scenario. And that's the role they have, and it changed structurally the position. And I think that where also you can see how in each country people don't believe about the same worst case scenario. In some way, you have a lot of contradiction at a political level, but the secret services work in coalition, and they construct a certain kind of setup which will drive that in the name of prevention. In the name of prevention, destabilize the idea about principle, data, privacy, but also principle of innocence, about the idea of organizing a society where the inflation of security is not destroying the principle of security. The idea is that you have one security is an error. You have contradiction between the logic of criminal justice security and preventive security. Preventive security creates more insecurity than it deserves security. And that's also, I think, an argument which is really important about this question of to whom. And I will stop there. It's not only about your own citizens, it's about all the internet users, for example. So why do you have an executive privilege? In French, we say raison d'etat, which creates a possibility for the executive to say, democracy is good internally, but forget it if we are in foreign affairs. And I think that's still a key element of the dark side, of the mindset that we have to challenge. Because if we challenge that, then, and we can successfully challenge that, then we will change the condition of possibility for creating this kind of transformation of oversight. Sorry, I was.
No, you're good. No, it's totally fine. This is what a good discussion is all about. So maybe we'll turn over to Cindy, some thoughts or reaction based on what you've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. In the report, you guys talked about different kinds of levels of oversight, which I think I hadn't really thought about that much before. You know, we talk about the internal oversight, what we do internally. We talk about Congress or the Parliament and some sort of legislative response. We talk about the judicial response, which is what you just talked about, Arnaud. And we talk about public opinion and the media. And then we talk about this international level that Didier is forcing us to look at, because he's really trying to say, let's challenge the status quo. Let's look at what's happening and make it different. But I think that this also builds on what Michael said about making intelligence better. You know, if the purpose of this improving oversight at the intelligence level isn't to make oversight better, then isn't to make intelligence better, then I'm not sure, you know, why you would do it, because we don't want to collect intelligence just to collect intelligence. I think that's part of your point. Let's challenge this idea that we're just collecting it to collect it because we can, right? But let's not also replace that with let's oversee it just because we can. Let's make sure that oversight is for a purpose. You know, and that purpose is to make intelligence better. And I think that that's why Elspeth's point about keying the privacy rights to the abuses makes a lot more sense. But I do think that, as Didier pointed out, not every country reacts the same way as every other one. You know, when Snowden's revelations came out in 2013, American public opinion was way up there. Yeah, let's protect privacy. And I think that Americans have kind of forgotten. And we don't have that great big groundswell anymore. So I do think that you're going to have to think about how you couch what you're doing at this international level, because a lot of people will say, we don't need it. We don't need this oversight at the international level. We've got plenty of other levels, and the cooperation is going to be incredibly difficult. So I would point out that the report has to have a pretty wide following to get the attention that you're gonna want. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much. It does. And so why don't we turn to you, Mike, some sort of closing remarks.
Sure. I have four things that might, I hope, be helpful. One is I do want to make clear that I am very much in favor of a very robust privacy protection regime, and pairing that as a human right, I think is a great idea. But I think if you look at the President's Review Group that was set up to look at the surveillance programs that were revealed by Edward Snowden, I think they really did the best job of explaining privacy not as an opposite of security, but as essential to security, right? We don't put a lock on our door just to protect the personal papers somebody might be able to go through if they came in our house. That's a form of security. It's our security. Our ability to protect some part of us is the security. So it'll get us away from this balance that's always easy for the intelligence agencies to justify moving to the other side of the spectrum. On the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act discussion, and excuse me if this was where you were going with the concept of politicization, that is a problem, and it's something that's hard to address when the overseers are selected from a group of people that's already been through a number of reviews, basically coming from the elite. So they're always going to have an elite perspective on these issues. But I think, you know, in looking at the history of the FISA court, the judges have actually done a pretty remarkably effective job. The problem was that they were captured. They were in an environment where they only got information from one source, and they had no ability to check that information. And in fact, even before 9/11, it was a huge problem where they would later find out when the returns didn't turn out to be what they expected, that they were being lied to by the FBI managers who are coming in and providing the affidavits to support their decisions. And then, of course, with the broader programs that the FISA court created, again, at the demand of the intelligence agencies saying they needed this to protect the world. They later found out that the few restrictions they were putting on that activity were routinely violated. And still, I mean, we're still having that problem over and over again being discovered, but again, it's discovered after the fact. So that, whatever mechanism, oversight mechanism, has to avoid that capture. And I think the way that you do it is tackle the secrecy. The real problem here is that, we're trying to create oversight bodies within a closed system, and it needs some sunshine in order for those systems to actually work. They have to worry if they write a FISA court opinion that within a reasonable amount of time, the public is going to see this. And if they disagree with our work, then we can start to calibrate it in a way that actually serves democracy rather than the needs of the closed system, the intelligence network in the closed system. So challenging that excess secrecy, I think, is essential, particularly because the secrecy, like the surveillance, is not nearly as effective as they pretend. I mean, one of the frustrating things, and I wrote a piece about this, I think it was published in The Guardian, about the anger and animosity and criminal charges against Edward Snowden, this idea that he had revealed these secret programs, when in fact, a Canadian officer who had access to these programs through the Five Eyes relationship had been arrested for having, for a period of 5 years, taken a thumb drive out of the office and sold it to Russian intelligence. So, there's this imagination that because the American public doesn't know this information, that our enemies don't know this information. And I think that's been revealed time and time again, whether through the Aldrich Ames incident, the Robert Hansen incident, that the wall of secrecy is easily penetrated by people who have an interest in doing that. And finally, I think it's a really, really good point about the companies that are now engaged in a lot of this activity that in many ways are not just enabled by the government, but rewarded by the government. And, in many of the cases that we're looking at, it's really very difficult to distinguish between what is the company behavior that it's engaged in for its own purposes versus what it's doing to please the government, either to avoid regulation or because of their, political inclination towards their home country or whatever, that we have to wrestle with that, because that again becomes a huge security conundrum. And again, here in the United States, we had a massive leak that's called in journalists dubbed the Blue Leaks, where the network of law enforcement intelligence fusion centers was penetrated by a hacktivist through a contractor who had access to this material because they were making money. And, obviously all of this information is very valuable. So when it gets in the hands of a private profit-driven entity, you can imagine that there will be other uses they make of that information. And that, again, it is an example of a measure taken using security as a justification that actually undermines security.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I completely agree with sort of this idea of commodification of intelligence or secrecy, right? We've certainly brought this up in our report, and to sort of shift it back, to leave the last word to our dear friend Elspeth here. I think what you said about absolutely right. They were fine in their work with what they're able to do, right? And so a lot of times it was technical, but not substantive in a matter because of the lack of access. And so having to shift and think about these things in terms would be great. And so maybe you want to say a few closing words, Elspeth, on sort of your legal ink. And show us the silver lining again. That's why I want to end on you because it is a Friday afternoon. We don't want to be all mopey.
I was thinking that perhaps a nice way to end would be a final reflection on security and how much security we want.
Yes.
And I will just use the classic example I use in class, which is if you are in a foreign city where you don't speak the language and you're walking down a very quiet road, do you feel more or less secure if you see a policeman coming in the other direction? No. Probably you're gonna feel a little bit more secure, though, you know, this is a foreign country, you're not quite sure. Okay. Same scenario, you're walking down a narrow road, 3 o'clock in the morning in a city where you don't speak the language, and you see 50 policemen coming towards you. Do you feel more secure or less secure? Really insecure, and you run like hell in the opposite direction. So I think we need to think about how much security is the right amount of security, how much security is consistent with how we want to live our lives, and bear in mind that too much security can be even more terrifying than not enough security. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I would say we wanted to do an open sort of Q&A session. I don't know how people feel. Mike and Cindy, do you have a couple of minutes in case there were questions from the audience? Maybe we'll do a quick survey here and see. And otherwise, we could certainly thank you for your participation and then mingle in the physical spaces like that Mike and Cindy go. So I'll look around the room. Are there any questions, comments from the audience that ought to be addressed? Yes.
One quick one.
Yeah. This is my colleague Daniela Paterka-Benton, also a professor, associate professor of justice studies.
So like one of the presenters on the screen or on the Zoom has mentioned that it could be really hard to actually get the intelligence communities to come together, right? If it's in terms of oversight, like if it's, you know, what is the purpose, the ultimate purpose of it? If it's better intelligence, they probably get behind it. In your report, like how do you actually view the issue of the private companies? Like would that be probably best regulated through, or would the oversight primarily come through the national countries that they are sort of like home in, or would that also be part of like this international oversight? Like how does one do that?
So this is a great question. I can take a first stab and then we can go through the room quickly, Zoom and here. I think the problem when you look at the Intel community, they really have come to terms with this. They're here to stay. Will harness the energy of, or will harness sort of the value of these companies, and so the pushers of sort of private intel gathering, collection, and execution really make sure that now, when the Intel community meets and has plans, they really come up with business plans that integrate these corporations already. And this is the initial problem that Didier mentioned. When you create a discourse and you repeat it often enough so that everyone, you legitimize it through repetition, and then everyone buys into this. And so right now, I'd say this trend is very much visible in the US, but it's already spilled over to strong allied countries such as Israel or other countries. And so that's a problem. The way we have not developed deeply on the private or corporate part of the issues. So it is part of the problem mapping, but certainly at stake or issue when we talk to civil society organizations or parliamentarian oversights, the clashes depending on the countries. In Europe, certainly different in terms of what that oversight should look like, whereas sort of the closer connections between the lobbying and Congress, for instance, in the US, much more problematic. But I'll give Didier Elspeth also a moment, and then turn to Mike and Cindy for comments also.
Well, it depends of what companies you are thinking. Private is almost at every step. It's not one step. It's the idea that you have the intelligence sensors and they delegate what they cannot do, but still controlling the private. It's completely illusory. At each step, this private is not private, really. It's more what we call para-private. So they look private, but if you do the biography of these people, oh, surprise. They are all military retired, people from the high tech, and so and they work very closely at a very top level of this kind of group of elites, which go back and forth between public and private. If you look, for example, at the one who are doing this cyber spyware that they saw, you can say they come from defense and cyber. And cyber, of course, it's very complicated because the same tools can be considered offensive or defensive. So you say, of course, we are defending our, and so we are doing counterterrorism, but if the other use the very same, it's offensive. So what ended up? It ended up with the necessity to use that as if they were war tools. And that's where cyber defense, war, the Wassenaar arrangement, for example, do we sell that? What are the conditions? And if you look at the case we had, a lot of people speak about Pegasus, but the French have been the one saying to Kennedy, the tools to control his own opponent when it was under Sarkozy. The Germans have been doing the same in Syria. So we can regulate by organizing, like we do in defense, a surveillance, and to take accountable the people doing that. In Israel, for example, yes, it's a private company. You cannot just say it's the Israeli government, but as the Israeli government could have the possibility to block it. They don't. They don't because you have a strong identity as a guild where all these people have interconnected relations, be they private or public. So I think it's really focusing on that, showing the relations they have and what is the purpose of what they do. And we have the, well, then we have the, do we have the willingness? Because you have such entrenched relation, it's something different.
Well, I mean, in Europe, this is, broken out as regards passenger name records. And we have now the courts, Court of Justice of the European Union, busy saying, well, the companies which collect that passenger name records, which are unverified information that we provide to every time we try and buy a flight, is then stopped and then it has to be transferred to state authorities under the law. State authorities have agreements with the US, Canada on this passenger name record stuff. And the question is, well, what law applies to these companies? And recently the Court of Justice said, no. The only law in respect of data protection, which applies to companies that collect passenger name records, is the law which applies to the private and the public sector outside of law enforcement. And the fact that the state authorities have asked for this bulk data to be transferred to them does not mean we can use national security arguments as a reason for transferring the data. They can't, and for their use of the data, because the state cannot give a private company national security duty, which the company is then supposed to interpret. So the court said, no, 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 no. That's the state, and the state has to do it, and nobody else can do it in their stead. And that then, of course, raises the question of passenger name records account, billions and trillions and, you know, however many millions of pieces of personal data every day that are passing through every time everybody's getting on and off the flight. How much are you going to have to enlarge your public service if you're going to be requiring them, if they are going to have to do all of the processing of that data themselves, and they can't offload it onto the private sector? Saying well, it's part of your job to run these different programs through this data and just tell us if they're any hits. So yeah, a big question which has huge economic consequences for the private sector and the public sector, and what kind of data protection regime is going to apply.
Great. So we see that the comments open up more questions rather than solutions. Cindy or Mike, would you like to say a 30-second sort of response to that? Otherwise,
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a big difference between the collection of data that's inadvertent and the collection of data that's deliberately to be part of intelligence decision making. And so it seems to me that once you're inside the secrecy sort of circle, there's a level of oversight that should be understood. But Elspeth's example of this kind of inadvertent collection of data that then later has an intelligence aspect, that seems to me that that's a completely different category. But I'll leave that up to the legal people.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And Mike? Good, good. You were muted, but you were shaking your head. So then I want to thank every one of you for this great discussion that we had today. Thank you for the guests that coming all the way from Europe, and thank you guys from remotely from and LA. We're very grateful. Have a wonderful weekend, and as you see, there's lots and lots of things that still need to be done. Thank you, Alfredo, for opening up the space here for us and joining us today. Be well and stay tuned and be in touch. One last thing, if you want to read about interesting things, you might not be able to see this here from the small camera. It is a journal called the Political Anthropological Research on International Social Sciences that really grapples with issues, not necessarily specifically on intel, but on broader issues with regards to democracy or human rights issues. So stay tuned, and we can also certainly pass this around in an email or with regards to something. So be well, and thank you again. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.